Well, hi everyone. I wanted to start something different, something new, and I don't know if it's ever been done before. Certainly not that I have seen, but I wanted to start building psychological profiles of biblical characters, and there are many, so there is a lot to choose from. But the reason I wanted to do this is because um, we read in the writings of Paul that these things happen and these stories were written for us, right? For us to think about what they mean, for us to reflect on the experiences and the backgrounds and the challenges and the adversity of many of these characters and also many of the mistakes that they made. And so I wanted to I wanted to start building these profiles because when we look at these characters, we always look at them from these perspectives. I think oftentimes, at least myself, from these perspectives that almost seem perhaps very distant and unrelatable, and sometimes glorified to a perspective that makes it even more unrelatable. And so I wanted to start building some of these profiles. So today I'm going to do Moses. And I thought I would start from the beginning and maybe perhaps do Adam and Eve. But because we have very little on them to a certain extent, and I think because the degradation of the psychological makeup of these individuals was not as extended due to the proximity to paradise that they were just in, and so there isn't this long overlay of data to work with. Perhaps maybe some of you think that there is, and I'd be happy to work on something together on that. Certainly, we could build some smaller ones on Cain and Abel, and I think I will. And perhaps some of those videos will be a little bit shorter. But today I wanted to start with Moses, and Moses is quite the character, and we have a lot from Moses because he plays a huge role in the Torah and Old Testament scripture. And so I wanted to start with kind of looking at a developmental background of Moses. Now, of course, we can kind of start with maybe just having a sense of the historical and cultural significance, which I think is very important to always note, in which Moses grew up in. Of course, he's played a huge role to various religions and ways of belief. Uh, of course, the Jewish tradition, Christians, and Islam, right? And so, and not to mention how much of a role this Moses figure played in shaping a lot of religious thought, law, and ethic, even though it wasn't necessarily him to a certain extent that was proposing some of these things. He was the forefront, or at least the person that was there. So he grew up in a very interesting era. It was certainly marked with a lot of upheaval and change, and the Israelites were a minority living in this majority culture, right? And so they were this minority in Egypt, and they were certainly at the bottom of the hierarchy. And these things are important to note because I think that we live in a time where we sort of don't realize the how these stories speak too much of what is our world today, and we often underlook these things as not necessarily significant or important, but surely they are important. So um, there was a lot of challenges in Moses' life, of course, and you know having having as a baby been put in this river and ending up in the Pharaoh's palace. um, it was certainly a very difficult time for not just Moses. Of course, he was a child, and we don't know exactly how much children can remember. They say perhaps around 3 years old that some memories can be formed early as two. So it's hard to say. Of course, he was under that age, as so we believe. And so we don't know how much of that experience he remembers, but certainly something like that would be very difficult to process. But of course, we don't know. We don't know that. What we do know is that Moses grew up in the Egyptian royal court, right? But he had some awareness of his Hebrew origins because his mother was um, still responsible for feeding him. And so there is this kind of unique experience that he gets to witness these two worlds, right? He has insight into the experiences of both the oppressors and the oppressed, right? And so again, thinking of these things in a modern context, you can start to perhaps paint a picture of maybe what Moses would look like in the 21st century. But he had um, both of these worlds, right? Though he lived much more in one world, he had an understanding of the other world. So it's certainly um, a complicated upbringing. So I want to get started into his developmental background. Right, so we talked about his Egyptian royal court and his Hebrew heritage, right? So he was born into a Hebrew family at a time where the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt. And so, to save him from Pharaoh's decrees to kill all the newborn Hebrew boys, his mother placed him in the Nile, where he was found and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And you can find that in Exodus chapter 2, verse 2, 2 to 10. So, growing up in the Egyptian royal court, Moses would have received the education and training that a member of the Egyptian elite would receive. So, that's something to take note of, right? Because Moses was also next in line to become Pharaoh. He was in those circles. He would have received the highest possible education that there was at that time and the highest possible training. And many of these things would have been qualities and traits that would have been important if you would be a leader, right? And so he's developing these leader traits in Egypt because there is that progression to become Pharaoh at one point. So you can imagine that this dual identity of Moses instilled a deep sense of empathy and understanding for the plight of his people, while also equipping him with the necessary skills and knowledge for leadership, right? So he's got this sense of empathy and the sense of understanding for his people, but then he also has these characteristics, these traits, and that's very important for a leader. You want a leader that has those qualities. So there's this complexity for him. And then when we continue looking at the story, so we see this encounter with injustice that he has, right? And there's this pivotal moment where Moses kills an Egyptian taskmaster for beating a Hebrew slave. So it's a demonstration of his sense of justice and willing to act on behalf of the oppressed. But also there is perhaps a sense there of high level of conflict within him, again with his identity and positioning high in that ancient time in the hierarchy, and especially being in the royal courts, but again seeing how devalued and how oppressed his people were. There was this storm within him, if you will, right? So and you can think of modern characters to a certain extent that would emulate that kind of life. And I think seeing this would make us more understanding of those individuals that we see in society today that have this level of experience that may move an individual to such actions, right? And I think that's part of understanding biblical literature, is to develop also this sense of empathy for Moses, right? Is you can sort of, not to justify his actions, but you can sort of understand that you might feel like doing the same thing should you be in a similar position. And we don't know because some of us have never been in that position, right? So another moment that we think about is the burning bush encounter, right? And this was the transformative event because he has fled, he has run away from Egypt because he is now a murderer. He has killed um, one of his people, if you will. He's killed a fellow Egyptian, and this is going to bring nothing but conflict. And of course, um, not to take away from the story, there's an element there in which he does this for the oppressed Hebrew, and that Hebrew is not very thankful for that. And so that, again, that increases, and it's almost a foreshadow. It's a foreshadow to the story that you see later on, which is he is taking them through the wilderness, he is taking them through all of this difficulty, and yet they are very unthankful for what has taken place. So how would that make an individual feel? Well, that would confuse them even further. It's like you are hated by both identities that you struggle with, right? And so you can see that. But then, what is the transformative thing that helps Moses rectify this conflict? And that is the burning bush encounter, and that's significant, right? And so it marks the beginning of his mission to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. And so, if we take a pause for a second, we can think about perhaps, and maybe there's ambiguity in the scriptures for this reason. And the question is, well, would it have been better for Moses to have left and never kill anybody and have this burning bush encounter and truly free the Israelites in a way that is more permanent than in the way that he was trying to seek? That is to say, perhaps the comparison of Martin Luther King Jr. and somebody like Malcolm X, right? One was through violence by any means necessary, and the other one was through this orientation towards the highest principle. And I think those are questions that we must ask ourselves that the story doesn't tell you, but it's neither here nor there from the perspective of whichever path is chosen. God can still work with that choice. So we have this burning bush moment, right? This experience is a profound spiritual awakening. He has his divine commissioning, and he finds his commitment to his people and to God, right? And you see something in there because he is reluctant to assume the role of the leader. He questions his own abilities and likelihood of the Israelites believing him. And so there's two things there, right? He received a lot of educational training in leadership, you would imagine, if that was his, you know, um, his end goal, if you will, maybe not his, but of the leadership, that he would be Pharaoh. He would have received a lot of this training. And it's interesting that he doesn't think that he's qualified to lead people, even though he has all of this. And so, again, it's another foreshadow that even leaders that possess these qualities, if they are not led by something greater than themselves, they will rely too much on their own skills and therefore become a god unto themselves for the people. And we see that today. And so Moses has this ripe humility to know that if he's going to lead anybody, it's going to be with God. So there you have it. The next is obviously the Exodus and the receiving of the Ten Commandments. So um, he leads the children of Israel out of Egypt, and not by any easy feat, if you will. It was a very difficult. He had to face what he grew up in. So he had to face the oppressor, if you will. And I know it's complicated in the sense that Pharaoh is this representation of the snake, which is a representation of the Satan character, or the Satan, um, or Lucifer, the devil. So in a sense, he's fighting a dual oppression. I think that's part of the narrative, in the sense that the oppression is not just the physical oppression that is seen upon the people, and this is perhaps what God was trying to get Moses to understand, is that behind what you see as physical manifestations of oppression is actually the spirit that is what makes oppression exist. And I think that's most important. And I think principally in today's society, the emphasis is more on the structures and the organizations than it is on the people running these structures and organizations. And so you have this sense in which, especially young people have this sense of desire to overthrow systems rather than to overthrow systems of beliefs, right? And maybe you can sort of superimpose the fact that Moses would have killed that individual when he was young, and here he is, 40 years later, I believe, and now he's much more mature. So his upbringing in the context of the cultural and identity duality that we see, combined with his encounters with divine purpose, this shaped Moses into a leader that was not just a liberator, but also a lawgiver and a prophet, right? This is the perfect individual to do these things. That is not to say that he is without fault, but he is certainly a peculiar individual to do this. Okay, now doing a little bit more of a personality analysis, right? So what are some of those traits and characteristics? So leadership and humility, for sure. So there's always this joke, right? Because in Numbers 12, verse 3, it says that Moses was the most humble man on the face of the earth. And you ask yourself the question, well, who wrote that? Because as far as understanding, Moses wrote the book of Numbers. And so there's a little bit of an irony there. Perhaps there was this sort of struggle conversation in which God told him, hey, you have to write that. And maybe he didn't want to do that. But he's been depicted as the very humble, more than any man on the face of the earth, right? So, and this humility is evident in his initial reluctancy to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. He was questioning his own capabilities and even God's choice. But despite his doubts, his willingness to embrace his role demonstrates a balance of humility and responsibility. And that's what you want in a good leader. It's a balance of humility and responsibility, right? It's an essential traits for true leadership. The other things that we can see about him is his courage and conviction, right? So his life is definitely wrought with many acts of bravery and strong sense of justice, as we discussed. His defense of the Hebrew slaves, his confrontation with Pharaoh, which showcases his standing up against oppression and injustice, driven by a deep conviction in his mission and God's directive. And so you have that courage and conviction. Other things that we see are patience and perseverance. I mean, he led a large and often contentious group through the desert for 40 years, which required immense patience and perseverance, right? So Moses' ability to navigate these challenges of leadership, including dealing with this dissent within the community that he we will foreshadow in the earlier story, demonstrates his ability to be long-suffering. Empathy and compassion. So we talked a little bit about his empathy and his interactions with both God and the Israelites. He's often interceding on behalf of people. Someone that has high empathy intercedes on behalf of people. You have social workers who part of their job is to advocate and intercede on behalf of people, right? So pleading with God to forgive their transgressions. So again, part of advocacy is, even in the court setting, would be a social worker asking the judge to please lower the sentence, to consider the individual nature of the situation, right? His deep connection to the people's struggles and dedication to their welfare, again, it showcases his compassionate nature. Again, some motivations, we see the sense of duty and divine calling, justice and liberation. We talked about faith and trust in God, right? Those are some other things. So now looking at some psychological theories to kind of bring into the conversation. Again, some of these are theories with sustenance to them, but looking at just looking at his life from a developmental psychology, right? Moses' early life experience, including his adoption into Egyptian royalty and then his later identification with the Hebrew slaves, is pivotal to his psychosocial development, which is part of Erik Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, um, especially in terms of identity versus role confusion, right? So his struggle with identity and eventual embrace of his role as a leader. I mean, he was meant to be the leader of the Egyptians, but he became the leader of the Israelites. And so, this is seen as a successful navigation, if you will, of this stage, right? So it's a strong sense of fidelity and purpose. And then if we look at something like attachment theory, considering that, Moses was separated from his biological family at birth and raised in Egyptian royal family, we can look at attachment theory to sort of dissect some of his leadership style. And so what we can see, though, despite the fact of the kind of upbringing that he had, he did form strong attachments despite his early separation, right? Which explains his deep empathy and sense of responsibility towards the Israelites. And we see through his actions that he has a secure attachment style, which allows him to be a compassionate leader despite the challenges, and he remains committed to his people and their welfare. There's a strong sense of attachment there. Looking at big five personality traits as far as classification, conscientiousness, openness, many of these things, agreeableness. So what we see in this story is that we can see his openness, right? So willingness to confront Pharaoh and lead his people, conscientiousness, his dedication to the mission. So he would be higher in conscientiousness. Extroversion, his ability to lead and inspire others. Agreeableness, right? So his compassion towards others, and neuroticism. And it's interesting because you would say he was high in neuroticism, right? So neuroticism is a proclivity for negative emotion, and he definitely was high in neuroticism, or higher in neuroticism, but towards the end, he overcame much of that. And so that, again, I think that's valuable as individuals to see that one can move from high neuroticism to low neuroticism, right? So that's really important. Another thing that we can think about is servant leadership. So this, I put this one in here. So this theory emphasizes the leader's role as serving the needs of others first. So servant leadership, it's a theory. So Moses' willingness to put the needs of the Israelites above his own, his intercession with God on their behalf, and his tirelessness in guiding them through the desert exemplifies servant leadership. And his servant leadership was deeply rooted in empathy and ethics and commitment to growth and well-being. So there's quite a lot there to think about when it comes to that. But we can talk about also some of his strengths and challenges. So I just want to highlight these, and then we'll kind of draw to a conclusion. But I hope this is kind of a beginning of conversations to start thinking of these characters in more of from a more dynamic and three-dimensional, if you will, perspective. And so some of his strengths: resilience and adaptability, deep faith and conviction, effective communication and leadership, empathy and compassion, right? Some of the things that we talked about. Self-doubt and reluctancy, for sure, were marked in his early leadership. The leadership burdens, right? So there was so many rebellions and incidents of complaint, and it really tested his patience. and he was often discontented with the group of people in the wilderness. So he faced leading a large community. He did face a lot of leadership burden. So conflict management, right? So yes, you can think about Korah's rebellion, the lapses into idolatry. So these conflicts really tested his ability to maintain authority and cohesion among the people. So conflict management were some of his challenges there, and personal sacrifice. I mean, he made significant personal sacrifice throughout his leadership. Um, and I mean, he himself was not allowed to enter into the promised land due to his act of disobedience with God. So um, that kind of really shows the personal cost of the mission, right? And the ultimate sacrifice. And you want a leader, if you will. I'm thinking as we think about election and political times. In a sense, you want a leader that is building the people towards the promised land, but he himself does not enter, right? Because then they are more focused on the objective of readying the people rather than rather than creating this promised land that is not something that one can create just artificially, but one that can be created when the individuals have reached the right level of psychological and spiritual conditioning. So that is a little bit of an overview, brief kind of profile on Moses. I hope that was useful, and we'll see you in the next one.